Today is May 15th, 1997. I'm speaking to you from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. We are very pleased on this day to have an interview with Dr. Robert Merton, conducted by a former student, Albert Cohen. It is very much worth noting that this will be the first interview on oral history that Dr. Merton has granted, and we are extremely pleased to have him and Dr. Cohen this day. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Robert, in your the article that you wrote in this collection called The Legacy of Anomie Theory,
Yes.
you write at considerable length and detail about the role of microenvironments on the shaping of people's thinking, the ways they define problems, how they go about them, and so on. Specifically, by microenvironments, we mean the context of teachers and students and fellow students and so on, whom we deal with in face-to-face interaction, and then how it shapes our thought. You deal with this subject mostly in relationship to the development of anomie theory, of which the founding document was, I think, 1937? SSNA. 38. In dealing with the elaboration of anomie theory, the contributions that students made to its further elaboration and so on. I don't recall that there's any discussion of that nature about the initial formulation of the paper itself, the first rather brief document called Social Structure and Anomie, which later on took on a life of its own and grew and grew and grew. But I've wondered about that. How do you have any reflections on the way in which your own encounters with teachers and students, so on, or whatever, bore upon the initial formulation of this rather powerful idea?
Oh, I have a very, very distinct recollection, which I think is in part confirmed here and there by documentary materials. I wasn't fully aware of it at the time. This is in retrospect. It all started for me in the early 1930s when I was a graduate student at Harvard and became interested in what was emerging as a functional orientation in sociological thought, largely derivative from the functional work of Radcliffe Brown and Malorowski in anthropology, and deriving, in my opinion, ultimately from Durkheim. And so when I finished my own studies, formal studies as a graduate student, I wanted to develop a formal exposition of what functional analysis amounted to. And in the event, I did. And as was to be the case for the rest of my academic life, I developed it in lectures to students to begin with. So there was a microenvironment to begin with.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the year that you were in the course in which I presented that, do you recall whether I dealt with social structure and anomie?
Oh, yes, I first encountered it during that course, 1939.
And that's why I have distinguished between what I call oral publication, which, as the term suggests, means thinking it aloud in the presence of some audience, and printed publication. Publication, by the way, you may think that's an oxymoron. Oral publication seems to clash as a notion, but of course it doesn't. Publicare means to make public, and you can do it in any number of ways, including the current one, which is oral publication going on at this very moment. So how did that end up in SSNA, in my opinion, the following way? I developed something I called a paradigm of functional analysis. Now, this was a quarter century or so before Tom Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions gave a very special and powerful meaning to the notion of paradigm. I had a more limited notion, namely a formal statement of the underlying assumptions, the fundamental concepts, the problematics, and the mode in which this kind of analysis would take course. In doing that, I became powerfully impressed by the way in which functional analysis had centered on functions, on the positive consequences of structures and of actors operating within social structures. And so I turned to the correlative notion of dysfunctions, a notion I took from medicine and biology, and started to look at the dysfunctions, the negative consequences for the structure and for classes of individuals within the structure of anything that was being explored. And so it was when I presented some ideas on bureaucracy. I focused on the dysfunctions of bureaucracy, whereas Max Weber, who of course created the tradition of work in bureaucracy, had only centered on positive functions. When I came to think of social conformity, I said, but what about social deviation, deviant behavior? And again, it was on what seems to be dysfunctional, but I soon concluded that that wasn't the interesting problem, as you know. The problem was what makes for deviant behavior, and particularly for differential rates of deviant behavior among various parts of the population. So that's the most general theoretical context of how SS&A appeared in the lectures at first and then found print in 1938.
You mentioned, I think, like feudal societies, for example, where most people are poor, where discrepancies in wealth are enormous, and where deviance may be on a very small scale. And I remember, if I may harken back to my own first impressions when I first read Social Structure and Anomie. You make that point there. And to my mind, the principal meaning or intent, perhaps, of that essay was to talk about differences amongst systems.
Yeah.
Sort of cross-cultural, comparative sociology of deviance. And I thought, wow, this is great. But it's my impression that the theory has seldom been used that way. Most people think of it as a theory of deviance in the United States.
There's no question, Al, that you've pinpointed an aspect of the original formulation, which is central to the original formulation, and secondly, that it was never followed up, either by me or in any substantial scale by others. If you go back to the various editions of SS&A, and there have been about 5 over a period of 20 years or so, I simply put the comparative analysis to one side, just as you declared. For what reasons? Simply because my style is not that of a comparativist. It is rather an effort to focus on the, what shall I say, the internal workings of a society and move in that direction. But the original paper starts with the comparative mode, just as you've outlined it. And it's an interesting, to me, an interesting example of a very widespread phenomenon in the history of science. Namely, the emergence of ideas that are carried a certain distance and then are lost in view and then are rediscovered often independently and developed. In fact, two of my colleagues, Harriet Zuckerman, a sociologist, and Joshua Lederberg, a Nobel laureate biologist, had jointly published a paper called Post-Mature Discoveries to refer to that phenomenon, namely a discovery that could have been made. There were no obstacles to it, no technical obstacles.
Time was right.
No, it is, time is right is a cheap, meaningless, superficial evasion of the problem. It's discarding the problem too easily. You have to identify in what respects the time was not right. But I won't get into that. At any rate, in my case, you've said it all for me. My style of work was not comparativist. I was led to think of the comparative context. If I hadn't, it wouldn't have led me to the focus of American society as distinctive. And the anomaly, the paradox, the irony was, here is the American dream that in its own way inadvertently contributes to high rates of deviant behavior when coupled with a social structure, class structure, I repeat, ethnic structure, gender structure, that makes for differential access to the opportunity structure, the changing opportunities, not only for economic success, I want to emphasize that. To my mind, SS&A deals with access to all sorts of opportunities, making friendships, entering into different social and cultural systems.
Put this discussion now in the framework of, quote, strain theory. I think it was Travis Hirschi who first used the expression to characterize a whole class of theories. More recently, Agnew has been Robert Agnew has been talking about general strain theory, and these two contexts of use are very, very different. With respect to Agnew's work and his rather considerable, I guess, following, I was wondering what thoughts you might have regarding the placement of social structure and anomie as an instance of something called strain theory. I can elaborate on the question, but I won't prepare it too long.
It would help me enormously, Al, if you were to take a minute or so to give your your understanding of the two kinds of strain theory. Not because I am publicly announcing my ignorance. I just finished the foreword to a forthcoming book called The Future of Anomie Theory. Edited by Nikos Passis and Robert Agnew. In that volume, which I read with some care, there's a great deal about strain theory, just as there is in the recent volume, The Legacy of Anomie Theory. But it would, I think for our conversation, it would help me enormously if you'd give a succinct summary of what you take to be these two versions of strain theory, and then I'll try to respond. Particularly
if I can... Two versions, you mean Hirschi and Agnew? Or,
yeah.
I thought I was going to get to ask the questions today after all these years. Well, Hirschi identifies a whole class of theories that purport to explain deviance as a consequence of something aberrational, something wrong, something that's gone wrong somewhere. That theories that are built on the premise that conformity is more or less natural because man is a social being. And so you explain deviance by finding psychological or other kinds of deprivations of problems and so on. And so you would be a strain theorist, I would be a strain theorist, and is in contrast to the notion that deviance comes more or less naturally to people. What has to be accounted for is conformity. Agnew, and incidentally, I have the feeling that when Hirschi uses the term, there's something pejorative about it.
Oh, no
because
question.
it's clear where he stands. Eh?
Well, no question.
When Agnew uses the term strain theory, he accepts social anomie theory as legitimate and powerful and deserving of high respect. But he said there are at the center of anomie theory is a notion of strain, the notion attendant upon disjunction between goals and means and so on. So people feel strain, and deviance is one way of resolving the strain or dealing with it. And he said, well, there are lots of other kinds of strain that people can experience, growing out of all kinds of socially structured circumstances and otherwise, and he wants to investigate those across the board. Then anomie theory, in which strain is a function of a particular structural situation, becomes one instance amongst many. And it was really mainly to your thoughts about that that my question was directed.
Well, I think I showed unaccustomed wisdom in asking you to summarize it, because I couldn't have done it with such finesse. Just a word or two about Travis Hirschi. I think you captured the essential argument, and the reason I don't find it compelling or leading to any modification, let alone rejection of social structure and anomie thought, is that it is essentially an evaluated, but judgmental remark that why do you make these assumptions? But the assumption is not there. The imputed assumption is not in social structure and anomie at all. That is to say, the modal response in social structure and anomie fourfold table, the very first one is conformity.
That's right.
And that is not assumed to be necessarily a psychological attribute again, but because social systems provide the bait, the reward systems, the reward and punishment systems to make for conformity. So his premise, which he imputes to me, is one that has no place in the original argument. So that's so much for Hirschi. If he were here, I'm sure the conversation would go further. With regard to the Agnew, again, where I think you capture both the core of his argument precisely, I agree with that. I agree with the core of his argument. And the only departure that I would propose from what he is suggesting is that social structure and anomie is not that special a case, not that delimited a case. And let me try to elucidate that. You may recall, well, as I've been saying every 5 or 10 years in print over a 50 or 60-year period now. Look, fellows, it's all in the original statement and in the subsequent paradigmatic essays on anomie theory that I've put forward from time to time. It is all there. Namely, the theory is not introduced to account only for deviant behavior with regard to economic success. It is much more general than that. The very notion of opportunity structure, once it was introduced, namely as changes in the distribution and character of opportunities in the course of time, which has its own problematics, that I don't go into, what produces those changes in opportunity structure. But those don't refer only to economic matters. We have opportunities to find a mate, and that was one of the earliest applications I gave. When you have different distributions of men and women, what we used to call boys and girls, in a local community, you are influencing the opportunity structure, finding a suitable mate. They are not only the numbers of the two genders, the two sexes, but their class distribution, and a whole set of such problems. And so Peter Blau has been developing that over the past 20 or 30 years, that implication of opportunity structure theory. So my only difference with Robert Agnew is he, I think, is understandably focused on deviant behavior. But SSNA is not confined to phenomena of deviance. That was its source, that was its focus, but it is an effort to deal with differential access to differing opportunity structures. Now, we're at a point now, Al, I feel, where we need a seminar for at least a semester or a year or so to explore the question you've introduced, but I think it's important that you got it on the record, so to say, on this oral record.
There have been papers on the application or applicability of anomie theory, opportunity structure theory, to with white-collar crime, more specifically the crimes and the deviance of organizations, or I would say collectivities. When I say collectivities, I'm emphasizing the fact that these organizations are socially treated as actors that do things. And this raises some questions about the fit or the relevance of a notion like opportunities, anomie, the whole thing, to explaining the behavior of organizations. And I think especially the problem of organizations, can they legitimately be treated as entities, as actors, or just a lot of people or whatever?
Mm-hmm. Well, the focus there, it's a correlative, of course. It's quite recent development. It's a correlative to both anomie theory and to Sutherland's differential association theory. I say it's a correlative because, as you know, I am so delighted you were introduced as my student, because for decades I have said, well, that's been lost sight of, since most historians of social science would say that Albert K. Cohen was Sutherland's student. Well, I think we can share you. Anyway, back to that's a digression, and some of us tend to digress invariably, and I belong in that category. Sutherland really introduced a minor revolution of thought when he introduced the very term and concept of white-collar crime. And that meant that you no longer could assume that official crime statistics, for example, as gathered up by the FBI, and that's a long story we can't go into here, may give a somewhat misleading notion of the distribution of deviant behavior. Now, with this new focus on deviant behavior of organizations rather than of individuals in certain social positions, combines organizational analysis and deviant theory, deviant behavior analysis. I think that in large degree, SSNA theory can in part be applied to those phenomena of organizational deviance. If you think about the reward system of organizations, they're rewarded for growth. They are rewarded for as growth as registered, let's say, in the stock price. The individuals who man the organization, in turn, are being judged within the reward system over the short run, as we know. Now, if you think about that, there's a goal definition of how have you been doing recently, which puts enormous pressure on those occupants of the positions who are, those occupants of positions in organizations that are responsible or judged responsible for the outcome. So you do have, so to say, a collective concern with getting on with it, and some fraction of the response to that will lead to the kinds of organizational misbehavior that has now become so familiar. I don't think that it is simply historically contingent, as I've just indicated, because some of those same pressures probably existed earlier. But you can see how there is a formal resemblance between the shape of such analysis, the shape of such organizational analysis, and the structure of anomie theory.